Welcome to the third episode of the 8-part podcast Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature, a tantalizing series about awkward novels, daring statements and dangerous quotes from 200 years of Russian literature. Today, Thou Shalt Not Copulate. Your host is Otto Boele, senior lecturer at Leiden University, specialized in Russian literature and film history. Otto, the opening music was composed by today's writer, Lev Tolstoy. I didn't know he was a composer.
The word composer would give him too much credit, but he has at least one composition to his name, this waltz in F major, which must have been created somewhere in his late youth. Tolstoy played the waltz in 1906 at his estate, Yasnaya Polyana, to a small audience that included pianist and composer Alexander Goldenweiser. Goldenweiser immediately wrote down the music, and this is how it has been preserved. But in this episode, we will not talk about the young, but about the late Tolstoy. Not the novelist, the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, but the activist, the guru, the remorseful nobleman who had said his goodbyes to literature, yet couldn't resist writing anyway. The text that is widely considered to be the most characteristic of this period is the Kreutzer Sonata, a highly controversial novella in which the late Tolstoy showed himself from his most uncompromising side. Just listen how the authorities reacted to the Kreutzer Sonata.
What is most striking is his total denial. Lev Tolstoy does not have a positive, constructive ideal to offer. At the same time, he has a point. He is rightly upset about the fact that society legitimizes fornication in marriage.
These words belong to Konstantin Pobyedonoscev, chief procurator of the Most Holy Synod. Let's say he was Minister of Religious Affairs under the penultimate Tsar, Emperor Alexander III. Pobyedonoscev was a powerful man, the ideologue and spin doctor of the Tsarist regime during the last 2 decades of the 19th century. In that capacity, he had many dealings with Lev Tolstoy, who criticized the Orthodox Church and had now produced his scandalous novella The Kreutzer Sonata, in which the hero, a murderer, proclaimed that traditional marriage was an utterly corrupt institution. And yet, Tolstoy had a point. As we've just heard, even Pobyedonoscev admitted that Tolstoy's novella raised some very important issues. So what to do? To the censorship department, he wrote the following.
When I ask myself, should the Kreutzer Sonata be banned in the name of good morals, I am unable to answer in the affirmative.
Eventually, after much lobbying, the authorities gave in, and the Kreutzer Sonata was allowed to appear in print. But it has always remained a highly controversial work, even after the Tsarist regime had collapsed. In the Soviet Union, Tolstoy's novels were eagerly adapted for film, but the Kreutzer Sonata was adapted only in 1987, when Gorbachev's new course of glasnost and perestroika was well underway. The novella caused a lot of commotion, both in Russia and internationally. Did Tolstoy really reject marriage? And what did this mean for carnal love, sex, even if it was practiced between spouses, and with the intention of procreation? To understand what we are dealing with, let's start with that concept of the late Tolstoy. What do we mean by it, and why is it so important? Very briefly, in the 19th century, Russian readers had known Tolstoy primarily as a writer of fiction. His novels, as well as his short work, received critical acclaim in the 1850s and 1860s. And when he published his thickest novel, War and Peace, about Russia and the Napoleonic Wars, his reputation was rock solid. But around 1880, when he was finishing that other great novel, Anna Karenina, he fell into a sort of a midlife crisis. Yes, he was a successful writer, but what's the lasting value of it? You don't take that to the grave. This is what he wrote in his diary on May 18, 1884.
Getting up was hard. I found a letter from my wife. Poor dear, how she hates me. Lord help me. If I have to carry this cross, so be it. Let it weigh on me, but this inner struggle is terrible. I'm having a hard time. I'm a good-for-nothing, a pitiful and useless creature who is only preoccupied with himself. At least one thing is good, namely that I want to die.
In the following years, Tolstoy manages, more or less, to overcome this midlife crisis, after which he decides to organize his life completely different. His guiding principle is faith, but not the faith as he got to know it as a child, with Orthodox services, complete with the worship of saints and icons. He honestly tries that for a while, but it's precisely this highly ritualized and superstitious interpretation of Christianity that turns out to leave him cold. Tolstoy wants to focus on the central message: love your neighbor. Neighborly love becomes the guiding principle that must determine one's attitude to life. All rituals, all mysticism is thrown overboard. Even speculation about an afterlife is out of the question. What remains is a very sober conception of faith that mainly comes down to practical virtue. How do I lead a morally good life here and now? This turnaround in Tolstoy's thinking does not come out of the blue. Tolstoy was always busy with projects in the service of self-perfection, despite, or precisely because of the fact, that in his younger years he had indulged in everything that God had forbidden: drinking, gambling, chasing after women. But what Tolstoy was experiencing now, at around 50 years of age, was far more drastic. And because faith suddenly assumed such a central place in his life, whereas previously it hadn't, we usually speak of Tolstoy's conversion. The late Tolstoy is therefore a converted Tolstoy, who in the last 30 years of his life increasingly took on the role of conscience of the nation, who argued for the abolition of the army, the state, and the church. He increasingly appealed to his readers through essays, pamphlets, and letters to the editor, because these genres allowed him to express his opinion more unambiguously than novels or fictional stories did. And the stories and novels he did write were often, not always, quite pedantic. He wanted to make his point at all costs. He wanted to be understood. Tolstoy took inspiration from, amongst others, the first Christians and religious communities such as those of the Quakers. The Quakers were known for their simple, austere way of life, far away from the city. You grow your own food, you stay away from modern society with its temptations and sinful pleasures. Hard, physical labor on the land, Bible study, and a personal relationship with God, these were the main building blocks of Tolstoy's new way of life. This way of life was further characterized by the rejection of every form of pleasure. Tolstoy renounced alcohol, tobacco, abstained from refined dishes, became a vegetarian, and, following Jesus, renounced all his possessions. The latter was not as dramatic as it sounds. The family estate, Yasnaya Polyana, where he was born and lived most of his life, passed to his wife, Sofia Andreevna, so he could continue to live there. Still, on paper, he was now a man without any possessions, which was entirely in keeping with his aspiration to become ordinary, like the people. Around this time, the Russian language even is enriched with a separate verb meaning to become more ordinary, aprostitsa. His wife, Sofia Andreevna, didn't share his new views and insisted that the family live in the city, in Moscow, at least in the winter. That's what most decent people do. And at this point, Sofia Andreevna got her way. Tolstoy's attitude to that other form of pleasure, sexual pleasure and sexuality in general, is even more complicated. But this may be a good moment to turn to the novella itself and see how the theme of sexuality is fleshed out. Tolstoy's readers were truly perplexed once they had finished the Kreutzer Sonata. What was Tolstoy trying to say? Formally speaking, the Kreutzer Sonata is a traditional 19th century story. It's a so-called frame story, a story within a story. A few passengers on a train strike up a conversation about modern marriage. In particular, about the question of whether it should be possible to dissolve a marriage. Divorce was, even if technically possible, not accepted in Russia and Europe in the 19th century. In this discussion, some participants take a very traditional point of view. A wife must simply obey her husband, and that's it. Others express a slightly more modern opinion. The only woman in this company argues that marriage should be based on true mutual love, because love alone consecrates marriage. At this point, the discussion is joined by a man who will turn out to be the main character, and who's been largely silent so far. All of a sudden, he demands an explanation from this woman. Does she understand what she is saying?
But what are we to understand by this love that alone consecrates marriage?
Everybody knows what love is.
But I don't know, and I should like to know how you define it.
How? It's very simple. Love is a preference for one man or one woman to the exclusion of all others.
A preference for how long? For a month? 2 days? Or half an hour?
No, permit me, you evidently are not talking of the same thing.
Yes, I am talking absolutely of the same thing. Of the preference for one man or one woman to the exclusion of all others. But I ask, a preference for how long?
For how long? For a long time. For a lifetime sometimes.
But that happens only in novels. In life, never. In life, this preference for one to the exclusion of all others lasts in rare cases several years, oftener several months, or even weeks, days, hours.
But what you say is terrible. There certainly exists among human beings this feeling which is called love, and which lasts not for months and years, but for life.
No, that does not exist. It is only in stupid novels that it is written that they loved each other all their lives.
But you are talking of physical love. Do you not admit a love based upon a conformity of ideals, on a spiritual affinity?
Why not? But in that case, it is not necessary to sleep with one another.
The conversation gradually becomes unpleasant. Most of the passengers also feel increasingly uncomfortable with this somewhat unpolished man who proclaims that modern marriage is a complete farce. It becomes even painful when the man introduces himself. He is called Posnychev, and he rightly assumes that his name will ring a bell. Just weeks before, the national press reported on his trial. Posnychev was tried for the murder on his wife, a murder he did commit, but for which he was eventually acquitted because his wife allegedly had cheated on him, and his rage had therefore been understandable. The train then arrives at a station. Some passengers get off, others seize the opportunity and move to another carriage. The only ones to remain in the compartment are this Posnychev and one fellow passenger, the actual narrator of the story, who's hardly intervened in the preceding discussion, but who is very interested in hearing Posnychev's story. How did he end up murdering his wife? So the first 2 chapters outline the situation, introduce the characters and the central theme. That's the frame of the story, so to speak. And this is followed by 26 chapters in which the embedded story is presented, the life story of Posnychev told by himself. Posnychev tells his life story with visible disgust and self-loathing. He literally has not a single positive memory of his youth, of his student days, and certainly not of his marriage. The whole thing becomes even more gloomy because Posnychev doesn't talk about it in a calm, composed manner. He's very agitated and even reacts indignantly when his interlocutor dares to object. He also makes an unpleasant coughing sound, as if he is constantly clearing his throat. He smokes continuously and drinks strong dark tea. Tolstoy describes this in very graphic details, so as to show what a tortured man Posnychev is. At the same time, Posnychev's life story is by no means unique. If we are to believe him, Posnychev has undergone a development, and a sexual development, that is quite normal. That is, and this is vintage Tolstoy, it's not normal, but society considers it to be normal, and therefore it's widely accepted. That insane situation in which something is considered normal when it isn't, already occurs in puberty, says Portnichev, and he explains how he became corrupted already at the age of 15.
It happened when I was still in high school. My oldest brother was a first-year student. I knew nothing about women yet, but like all the unfortunate boys of our circle, I was no longer an innocent boy. I had been spoiled by other boys more than a year before. I was already tormented by women, not by any particular woman, but by women as something glorious, by every woman, by the nakedness of women. My lonely moments were not pure. I tortured myself the way 99% of our boys torture themselves. I scared myself, suffered, prayed, and fell. I was already depraved in fantasy and reality, but I had not yet taken the last step. I perished alone, but had not yet laid hands on another human being. But a comrade of my brother persuaded us to go there after a drink. We went. My brother was also innocent and fell that same night, and I, a 15-year-old boy, defiled myself and cooperated in defiling a woman, without even understanding what I was doing. After all, I had never heard from anyone older that what I was doing was bad.
Debauchery then becomes a standard practice in Portnichev's student years and early career, and this continues until he decides to get married. He then seems to sober up a bit, but already during the honeymoon he begins to understand that marriage is an emotional roller coaster, full of ugly fights and passionate reconciliations. And these reconciliations, Portnichev now concludes, were just as depressing.
Sometimes, it's horrible to think of it now, after the worst reproaches, suddenly silent looks, smiles, kisses, hugs, filth. What filth! How could I not have seen the filth of it then?
The hysterical arguments and sordid reconciliations go on, and after about 10-12 years of marriage, Portnichev's wife, he only refers to her as my wife, we never get to know her name, starts to blossom. The most acute concerns for the children are pretty much over, so she can afford to worry more about her looks. As he sees his wife change, Portnichev's anxiety grows.
She was a woman in the full bloom of her 30 years, who is well nourished and knows how to excite. Her sight was unsettling. When she was among men, she attracted all eyes. She was like a well-fed horse that had been harnessed and was now given free rein. But, like 99% of the women, she did not know the reins. I felt that too and found it frightening.
This blossoming of Mrs. Portnichev also manifests itself in the fact that she takes up playing the piano again. She starts playing together with a violinist, a certain Truchachevsky, a somewhat obscure family friend. Portnichev doesn't like it at all. He becomes jealous, but he hides his feelings, pretending he generously supports his wife in her musical endeavors. Meanwhile, his conviction grows that his wife is having an affair with the violinist. The highlight of this musical collaboration is a house concert for friends and acquaintances, where Truchachevsky and Portnichev's wife perform Beethoven's Sonata No. 9, Opus 47, also known as the Kreutzer Sonata. For Portnichev, it's a very sensual piece of music, and he also sees how it affects his wife. He has never seen her like this. He is struck by her radiant eyes, the dignity of her expression, and that image continues to haunt him. Even when a few days later he goes on a business trip, this image of his enraptured wife will not leave him. He still can hear Beethoven's music in his head, and he is now absolutely sure his wife is having an affair with that violinist. He immediately returns home in the hope of catching the lovers red-handed, and in a sense he succeeds. He doesn't find them in bed, only in the drawing room. But the fact that this Truchachevsky is in his house, while he, Portnichev, is supposed to be away on a business trip, is enough proof for him. He goes into a frenzy, several skirmishes ensue, and finally, practically in the presence of their children, he stabs his wife with a dagger. She dies within hours. The events described are, of course, already dramatic enough, especially since it remains unclear whether Portnicheff's wife cheated on him or whether he just imagined it. Probably the latter. But what made Tolstoy's story really problematic in the perception of his contemporaries is the conclusion that Portnicheff seems to have reached. Yes, he is sorry, he tells the narrator, but if all these events have taught him anything, then it's the insight that true love does not exist, that people are really only driven by gross feelings of lust, and that marriage is a ludicrous masquerade intended to legitimize the sex drive. Sexuality is, by definition, filthy, degrading. People should not give in to it, even within marriage, and not even with procreation as a justification. The anonymous fellow passenger objects. What about offspring? If people wouldn't have sex, humanity would cease to exist. But this argument doesn't impress Portnicheff. So be it. Why should humanity survive?
This is Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature. Your host is Otto Boele.
What were the reactions to the Kreutzer Sonata like? Were there any critics or readers who endorsed Tolstoy's radical analysis? It will come as no surprise that the strongest reactions came from representatives of the Orthodox Church. Archbishop Nicanor published an extensive refutation of the Kreutzer Sonata, in which he argued that the story was nothing but blasphemy and a mockery of the Orthodox faith. Tolstoy himself was called a chicken without a head, a fool and a false prophet.
How does Count Lev Tolstoy have the nerve to tell his widely respected and, it is said, sensible wife before the whole world what he said in the Kreutzer Sonata, namely, that by being married for so many years and having given birth to quite a few children, they committed smut? How dare he say his already grown sons, counts to their face, that they are but the product of debauchery and filth? Is this not a clear sign that the man has been blinded by his satanic pride, and his brain is no longer properly working?
Yet this Nicanor, and other clergymen who spoke out on the matter, also saw in Tolstoy a partial ally in the fight against moral depravity. They admitted that modern marriage and family life in Russia left much to be desired. The reactions were therefore mostly negative to very negative, but like Pobyedonoscev, these clerics also saw the socially critical side of the story. Professional critics were more moderate in their wording, with a few even attempting to distinguish between Portnicheff, a fictional character, and Lev Tolstoy, the writer. Fellow writer Anton Chekhov was deeply impressed by the Kreutzer Sonata, but was annoyed by the fact that Tolstoy was very poorly informed in the medical sphere and apparently hadn't taken the trouble of brushing up his knowledge. Ordinary readers also took to the pen, writing directly to Tolstoy to share their admiration or annoyance with him, and in some cases also receiving a personal response. But the prevailing sentiment was one of bewilderment. Did Lev Nikolaevich really want people to stop having sex? The criticism often focused on this single point, no sex at all. And because Tolstoy was often asked to explain the message of the Kreutzer Sonata, he eventually decided to write an afterword. Like the story itself, the afterword circulated as a clandestine publication for a while before it eventually could be published. In the afterword, Tolstoy lists a number of arguments that he has sought to make in the Kreutzer Sonata. He points out that children are less and less accepted as a natural and logical consequence of sexual intercourse. They are increasingly seen as a hindrance, a barrier to even more sensual pleasure. Here Tolstoy is of course referring to forms of contraception, such as periodic abstinence, but also other means that came on the market at the time. In the Kreutzer Sonata, we see this reflected in Mrs. Portnicheff's blossoming and becoming even more attractive. Disconnecting sensual pleasure from having offspring found no mercy in Tolstoy's eyes. If you don't want any children, then only total abstinence is an effective and morally sound remedy. As for the danger of human extinction, if no one would have sex anymore, this is what Tolstoy had to say about it.
The end of mankind is something that a true Christian cannot worry about. After all, that is described in the Revelation of John, the last book of the New Testament. And it won't keep a scientist awake at night either. He also knows that the sun will one day go out, and all life on earth will come to an end.
Tolstoy's second point relates to prostitution, a phenomenon that Postnishev got to know at the tender age of 15. The fact that the state tolerates prostitution, and to a certain extent even facilitates it, with a registration system and medical checks, is a chutzpah. Prostitution is for any sane person, certainly for a Christian, a completely reprehensible phenomenon. Here Tolstoy also lashes out at the medical science that justifies brothel visits for young men on the grounds that it's better for their health. Indeed, the view was still widespread at the time that masturbation was more harmful than visiting a prostitute, which was considered an emergency valve. Finally, and this is what readers wanted to know in particular, how feasible was this ideal of absolute chastity? Wouldn't even genuinely committed people at some point give in to their natural desire? To this argument Tolstoy reacted by pointing out that when an ideal appears to be too ambitious to be fully realized, then it doesn't follow that the ideal is wrong and should be abandoned completely. So we should see the ideal of total abstinence as a guideline, just like the teaching of Jesus Christ, which also doesn't contain a list of clearly defined commands and prohibitions, but should be seen more as a compass that broadly indicates the right direction. Tolstoy urges his readers not to fixate on whether the ideal of total sexual abstinence is achievable or not, but on the idea that sex per se is something degrading, an attack on man's dignity. And while we shouldn't equate character with author, some of Postnishev's ideas are also those of Tolstoy. If there was one person who truly hated the Kreutzer Sonata, it was Tolstoy's wife. But why exactly? Sofia Andreevna was 18 when she married Tolstoy, a young, innocent girl. Tolstoy was 34, and, as was usual for men of his age and position, he had already had quite a few women. From one of those many casual relationships, with the wife of a serf, a son was born in 1860, Timofey, who would later act as a coachman for Tolstoy's legal children. The first legal child, Sergei, was born in 1863, a year after they were married, 3 years after Tolstoy's first illegitimate son. The last, Ivan, was born in 1888, when Tolstoy was working on the Kreutzer Sonata and his new ideas about sexuality had long since taken shape. In total, Tolstoy and Sofia Andreevna would have 13 children, 8 of whom would live to adulthood. Sofia Andreevna rightly believed that she could speak her mind when it came to sexual abstinence and its feasibility as a kind of behavioral model. To tell her side of the story, she decided to write a countertext, a roman à clef, a novel with a key, in which she not only took a stand against the Kreutzer Sonata, but also gave a fictionalized and extremely nasty portrait of her husband. Whose Fault Is It, as the novel is called, is about the same length as the Kreutzer Sonata, and it's anything but a masterpiece. The portrayal of the characters is unbalanced, sometimes downright contradictory, the style is poor throughout, and the sympathy for the central character, Anna, in whom you can easily recognize Sofia Andreevna herself, is too obvious. Even so, from a historical point of view, it's interesting to read a kind of alternative Kreutzer Sonata written by Tolstoy's wife and told from a female perspective. The novel is clearly modeled on Sofya Andreevna's own marriage, so the heroine's husband, the virile Prince Prozorsky, 16 years her senior, is instantly recognizable as Lev Tolstoy. Actually, it never becomes clear what Anna sees in this man, because he is vain, hypocritical, petulant, jealous, and extremely selfish. Yet the reader is supposed to believe that what Anna feels for him is pure love. The narrator measures Prince Prozorsky not only as a human being, but also as a thinker and intellectual.
Prince Prozorsky was not so much handsome as exquisitely elegant. A broad education and considerable means had opened doors everywhere for him. Now he was tired of everything, had settled in the countryside, and was busying himself with philosophy, imagining himself to be a great thinker. That was his weakness. He wrote articles, and it seemed to many that he really was very intelligent. Only sharp and very knowledgeable people realized that the prince's philosophy was in reality pathetic and ridiculous. He composed and published articles in journals without having anything original to say, merely regurgitating old worn-out ideas from a whole range of thinkers, both ancient and modern. This rehashing was done so skillfully that the majority of the public read his articles even with some enjoyment. His limited success pleased the prince greatly.
But of course, it's not about Prince Prozorsky's intellectual abilities. It's about the relationship between the spouses. And this relationship is gradually deteriorating. Just as the first 2 years of marriage between Tolstoy and Sofya Andreevna were relatively happy, after which they drifted apart. Looking after and home teaching the children, running the household, everything falls on Anna's shoulders. The prince doesn't interfere in anything, has little interest in his own offspring, and doesn't really love his wife. Nonetheless, he's jealous. When Anna is introduced to an old friend of her husband's, a certain Bechmetov, and takes sympathy for him, the prince soon suspects her of adultery. Tensions run so high that at one point the prince takes a heavy presse-papier from his desk and throws it at Anna. The presse-papier hits Anna in the temple, and within hours she's dead.
It had to be. Forgive me, you are not to blame. But if I die, I have to tell you...
What? What? Say it, for God's sake! Hurry up and tell me now!
I was never unfaithful to you. I loved you as much as I could, and I will die with a clear conscience before you and the children. But it's better this way. Oh, I feel so tired.
Anna, I am guilty before you. Anna, my dear, forgive me.
I wanted a different kind of love. One like... Oh, you are not to blame. You couldn't understand that. What's important in love?
Was this novella by Sofya Andreevna some kind of revenge? Or an attempt at self-justification? Maybe both. On February 12, 1891, she writes in her diary,
Deep in my heart I felt that the Kreutzer Sonata was directed against me, that it had wounded me, humiliated me in the eyes of the whole world, and destroyed the last remnant of love between us, and without ever earning suspicion for my husband with a gesture or a look at anyone during my entire married life.
What happened next with Tolstoy and the sexual question? That question occupied him until the last moment. After the Kreutzer Sonata, he wrote several more stories in which the sex drive plays an important role, as a force that threatens to dominate all our actions. Tolstoy had already been strengthened in this idea by Arthur Schopenhauer, who regarded our sexual urges as a manifestation of der Wille, the elemental, primordial force that controls all living things and makes us unwilling victims.
But what about the human species? I don't know. I only know that the law of copulation that applies to animals does not apply to man. To him, the opposite applies. The ideal of chastity. What exactly does that mean? I don't know. I only know that if I follow the highest impulses of my being, those of love and chastity, only good can come of it.
Tolstoy would never let go of this idea. Even half a year before his death, in May 1910, he returns to the same question to conclude, only absolute chastity can redeem humanity.
Thank you, Otto. Absolute chastity, no sex. What are the main themes in the next podcast?
Well, sex is again an important subject, but this writer, Mikhail Artsibashev, seems to turn things around. Sex is allowed, the more the better, and he doesn't say no to a good glass of vodka.
Could you write something like that in a novel around 1900?
Not really, no, and this is what Artsibashev found out the hard way.
Scandal and Controversy in Russian Literature is a podcast by Otto Boele and Kai Mastenbroek, produced by Electrical Films. Voice actors are Maruska Hamer and Domenico Gemoli. This series was made with contributions from the Anna Croisset van der Kap Fund and the Leiden University Center for the Arts in Society. The names of the translators and other important references can be found in the description of this podcast. The series is copyrighted by Otto Boele and Electrical Films.